Do you validate your request body? If not, then you definitely should, because people are going to send you garbage. And in this video, we're going to cover how to do that. By the way, I put timestamps in the description down below. So in case you feel bored, just feel free to skip ahead. Okay, so here's the scenario. We have a server, and let's just pretend we have one endpoint, which is called /dev, and that is like a post request. So we're just going to pretend that you can send like a payload with an email, a first name, a date of birth, a country code, and this is then stored like on our server. And sometimes people are a little bit sloppy, so they leave out certain fields that we expect, or they basically put the wrong thing inside of the fields, and that is what we want to catch. And you should always do that. Like you should always validate like the request body before you even attempt to process it. And this is what we're going to do right now. And to do this, we are going to use this little library here. It's called Yup. It's actually a replacement for Joy, because now that Happy.js is deprecated, we need a replacement, right? And this is the one. So yeah, let's just use that. So enough talk. Let's just open up the terminal, and I'm just going to create a new project, and I'm going to say npm init-yes. Okay, and it created like a project here, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to npm install, what do I need? Express, yup, it's a funny name actually, and then I'm going to npm install but save dev, what do we need? Nodemon, right? Let's install Nodemon so we have a simple hot reload feature, because otherwise it's annoying. We always have to restart the server, and that is just annoying. Okay, so that should be done in a second, and once this is done, we can actually start coding this. So at first we need to set up like a skeleton, like the server skeleton for this, and that's what we're going to do right now. So let's open this thing up. VS Code always takes a little bit, so whoops, here it is. Yeah, and let's look at the package.json. Perfect, exactly what we want. We have Nodemon, we have Express, we have Yup. All right, so let's create like a script. Let's call it dev, and I'm going to say Nodemon index.js. And this file does not exist yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch this file, and here it is. And I'm now just going to create create a simple server, and I'm not going to explain like much here, because it's like almost boilerplate. Express, and because we care about the request validation after all, right? Not so much about the server. Okay, so I'm just going to plug in like a JSON parsing middleware, and then I'm going to say up.listen, and I'm just going to hard code like port 8080. Console log server running on port 8080. Typically you would have a configuration for that, but we don't need this for this tutorial. Okay, nice. So now that we have this, we need some routes. And let's make a directory, and let's call this routes. And please don't put like your routes in your main index.js file. That's super ugly, and you're not going to pass a code review with that. So it's definitely going to raise a couple of eyebrows. So yeah, let's try to do it properly. Okay, so let's require Express, then I'm going to create my router. And then I'm going to say router.post, and we set /dev. Yeah, and then we have something. And also here as well, like don't put the request handling like logic over here directly into a routes file. It just doesn't belong there. Let's create like a controller for it. So a controller that allows you to handle like these requests. So I'm going to create like a directory, and I'm going to call it controller. And inside of here, I'm going to call it dev. And what I typically tend to do is I make a class and then later on use dependency injection. I think I'm also going to do a video on what that is and why this is extremely useful. But I'm just going to create a class now and just going to export like one instance. Technically, I could have done just a normal function, but I tend to do it like this because then otherwise it's easier to add dependency injection. Okay, and I'm going to say, okay, I have like an endpoint. This is like create def, and I think I'm just going to not do anything here. So I'm just going to console log this, console log JSON.stringify, and I'm just going to log like the request body out with a little bit of pretty printing, and then I'm going to just return request passed. So we are actually not going to implement the database logic over here because we just don't need it. Cool. And what we need to do right now is we're just going to import our controller. So I'm going to say oops, it's like one up, right? Yeah. And then def, and then I'm going to say right here def controller dot create def. Yes. Okay, so that should in principle do it. So now we can start this thing up, and yeah, it's up, so that's fine. Let's just try this out. So at the moment it's not doing anything, right? So technically if I were to send this, I should get something. No, there's like an error. Where's like the error? There's like it's like some problem here. What is that? Oh, sorry, we forgot to export this and plug it into our server. Sometimes I just tend to forget that because you just get distracted by just talking and coding, you know, and you also want to do it rather quickly so that it doesn't get boring. And here I need to plug in the router, and then I will say, oh no, it's routes, right? Yeah. Okay, so now it should have like the route. Okay, let's send this. Yeah, and you see like request passed. And at the moment, like you can put anything in here, right? You can leave this thing also completely empty. You can send it, and it's just always going to tell you, oh yeah, don't worry, like your request is fine. But this is actually not what we want. We actually want to enforce that certain fields in this payload are there, and if they are not there, then we want to return like a bad request error. So like a 400 status code, and hopefully like a meaningful error message. So that's like the goal. And one approach that I see quite often, which I actually don't like so much, is that people attempt to do like request validation in here. So they basically do something like if request.body. I don't know, email, or if it's not there, you know, then I return something. Then I return like, I don't know, bad request. Do something like this, status 400.json, email must be there. So, I mean, you can do that, but I don't think it's a very elegant approach, and it kind of pollutes like your controller as well. So you don't want to be concerned with like validating this inside of the controller. It should just be done up front. And the way I typically do this is I make middleware, and I plug this middleware in before the controller, and this middleware is going to check like the request body, and if it's not in the expected format, it's going to return an error straight away. So like so, your controller knows that the request body is like conforming to whatever you're expecting. And of course, we first have to define like how this request body looks like, right? And that's why I'm going to make a directory and call it DTO. So DTO stands for data transfer object. It's quite a common term actually, especially in the Java world. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create like a new file, call it def. And inside of this file, we are actually going to define the requirements for our request body. And to do this, we're going to use like this little library here called yup. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to export like an object. And this is like what we need to do. And by the way, if you're surprised like how this works, you can read all of that in here. Well, actually you don't even need to read all of it. You can just scroll down like to the first example. And then you see, okay, yup.object. Okay, this thing is like an object, and then shape, and shape defines like how it should look like. And then you can just specify like your, like however it's supposed to look like. And you can see, okay, you can say it has to be a string, it has to be a number, a date, for example, and then they show you also like how to validate it. So it's like pretty straightforward and very similar to Joy, right? Because we need replacement. So yeah, let's just put our request, or let's just specify our DTO. So I'm going to say this email is a string. It is required. So if you do not pass it, I'm going to return like an error, and it is an email. And then I'm going to say, yeah, well, your first name is also a string. I'm going to trim it. So in case you give me something with like leading or trailing spaces, I'm going to remove them. I mean, there's like more things that we could do, but for now I think it's fine. And date of birth, we're going to say, yeah, this is like a date, and this is also required. And that's just one more thing I wanted to show you, because it's like a little caveat here. I'm just going to say country code, and I'm going to say, okay, this thing, it has to be a string, it has to be exactly 2 characters, and it defaults to US. Okay. So as you can see, it's like extremely simple to kind of specify these DTOs. It almost reads like a normal English sentence. It's like pretty straightforward. Yeah, so now we have to find this thing, and what we now need to do is we need to like create a method to actually validate our DTO. So I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to call it middleware, and inside of this I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this validatedto.js. And this thing is actually interesting because it's basically a middleware factory, and I'm going to show you what this means. Sounds super fancy, but it's actually quite simple. So what this thing is going to do is you can give it like a schema. So a schema is basically this yup object, so something like this. And what this is supposed to do is it is supposed to return like a middleware. So something with request response next. And this middleware is actually going to validate like the request body. And if it's not valid, it's going to explode. And if it is valid, it's just going to let it pass. Okay. And the way this works, maybe we can go back to quickly search for it. So you can have like multiple options for validating schemas. You can use this isValid thing, or you can use, there's like this .validate. Yeah, here it is. So as you can see, all you have to do is you have to call schema.validate, and this thing is going to return a promise. And if it is valid, the promise is going to resolve, and if not, it's going to like throw an error. And that is actually quite handy that it returns promises, right? So let's just say, okay, I'm just going to say await schema.validate, and then request.body. So what this thing is going to do is it's going to call this validate function. It's going to wait for the result. And if it throws an error, then we know that the thing is basically invalid. And if it is valid, I can just call next. So next passes on the control to the next router in the line, in the chain. So the thing here is the following. There's a little caveat to this. So if you go to, or if we go to this little object here, we see that we are applying default values. And the way this works is that if you put something inside of this validation library, it is taking like the object and it's applying default values, and then it's going to return a new object. So it's not going to modify the request body in place. So that means if I do not pass like this country code, then the validation library is going to add this country code, like the US, but it's not going to modify the request body in place. It's going to return a new object. So this is basically what this returns. And I think I'm going to show you later on like why we need this. So you get like this validated object with the applied defaults. And then what we are going to do is we're going to replace our request body with this validated body. So this is really important because now we know that in that we have applied like the defaults. Okay, and if we have an error, well, what do we have to do? We just, now there's two options. So we could do something like this, right? And then like this. Yeah, that would work, but it's like not very elegant. So maybe we can find like a better solution. And I think I already made like a video about this, about error handling. So I'm just going to make a new directory and I'm going to create like a new file. I'm going to call this API error.js, because the problem with this approach is, you sort of can hard code like these status codes, but it's like very ugly. And you always have this these magic numbers floating around, and that is just super annoying. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create like a custom object. And this is basically an object that we can create if we encounter like an expected error, right? So this object is basically safe to be passed back to the user. And this is like the message, and then I'm going to say return new API error 400 message, right? So instead of hard coding like this status code 400, what we're just going to do is we're just going to say, okay, we have this API error class and we can just create an API error. And one thing you should always have a middleware that handles, or like an API error handler basically. And let's put this inside of here as well. So I will just say API error handler. So this thing is going to be something that is plugged in like at the very end, and it should handle like all the expected and also unexpected errors, right? Because what you want to make sure is that you never ever leak like any implementation details. That would be really bad, because then someone can like attack your server. And the important thing to note about this API error handler is that instead of 3 parameters like a normal middleware has, you have like 4, and the first one is like the actual error. And what I typically do is I just say, okay, I'm just going to console log the error. Now in production, I already said it 5,000 times, don't use console log or console error, because it is not async, right? If the payload is big and you're logging something synchronously, you're blocking the main thread, and then you really have yourself a situation because your server is going to be very slow. And what we will just do is we're going to say, okay, if this thing is like an expected error, so like an instance of this API error we just created, then we are going to return whatever status code the error has, and we're going to return the message as JSON, as the response, I mean. And if not, we're just going to return like a generic 500 error. So I'm just going to say internal server error, something went wrong. And this is important, by the way, because say something does not work with your database and you by accident return some details on how like your database works or what database you're using. This can be very critical. So try to avoid that. And now that we have this error handler, the only thing we need to do is we need to plug this thing in. So I'm just going to say app.use. And I think we can directly say API error handler. Oh, cool. It automatically did it. Nice. And that is API error handler. So we now plug this thing in as the last middleware, and what we can now do is we can say something like next API error.bat request error. That is good. So that looks a little bit more elegant, right? Now you might say, okay, well, technically we could have also just returned like the we could have also just returned this hard-coded this bad request. Yes, we could, but just do it like properly, right? Because you're going to have more errors like later on. You will have internal server errors. You're going to have all kinds of errors. Like you need to make sure that your server is handling errors like gracefully and correctly so that it doesn't crash. It's extremely important. A lot of people forget that. They only do the happy case, and then this thing completely blows up like once it's in production. So yeah, whoops, a little fly flying around. Okay, I think there's just one more thing to do now. Before we actually call this create def method, we should use our create middleware function. So I'm going to our validate DTO function, I mean. So I'm going to say, I'm going to import this validate DTO function, and I'm going to import the data transfer object. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this middleware here, and I'm going to say validate DTO def DTO. Yeah, that's it. So that should work actually. Let's see whether we have some issues here, because maybe we forgot something. Oops. npm run def. Okay, so at least it's starting. Let's see. Here's our Postman. So I am going to just cut this and let's see what happens. So it should actually return an error now. Wow, it's really slow. What's going on here? Invalid status code. What? Maybe we have some little issue here. This guy? Oh, because it's error.code, I think. Yeah, could be. I think this could be it, yeah. Postman, let's see. Let's try again. Nice. Cool. So as you can see, yeah, we kind of get like an error back. We say, date of birth is required. Because at the moment we're not sending like anything, right? So what happens if we maybe put date of birth in, but we leave like this out? Then we should get a proper error message as well. Okay, so here you can see basically the things that you send, and then below here it's going to say, oh yeah, it's like a required field. So that's pretty cool. Let's maybe do it like correctly. Yeah, nice. So now it passes, and you can also see that it's a little bit that it's kind of smart a little bit. So if I pass like some garbage, like for the date, it's going to say, oh yeah, that's like an invalid date, it cannot create it. That's pretty good. And what I wanted to show you as well, but I think for this I need to, oh yeah, we're already logging it, I think. Let's remove this. Let's remove this real quick. And I just want to send this, and let's check like let's check the logs. So as you can see here, we now have like this country code US. So it did apply the default. And I just wanted to reiterate what I said before. Let's comment this out for a second, and let's not update the request body. And if we do this, then it will pass anyway because the country code is not required. But as you can see, we only have these 3 fields. So it's like extremely important to like replace the request body here. Yeah, so I think that's it pretty much. That is how you do proper request validation. And as you can see, it's a pretty scalable approach. So if you have like more DTOs, you would just add more DTOs over here. And then in your routes file, you would just add like this little middleware here, and then you're done. And since we have everything nicely like separated into controllers and into this routes directory, it also looks like quite good. So I would say it's quite easy to understand. Nice. So thank you very much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe. Leave me a comment if you have a question. You can also reach out to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @productioncoder. And I've also put an email list in the description down below. So if you guys want to have a say in what we build next on this channel, if you have any idea, you can sign up there, and then every once in a while I'm going to send an email along. So again, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.